50 meters beneath the Baltic Sea, a sonar image captures something that should not exist. 7 U-boats are arranged in a tight formation, their hulls intact after 8 decades, sitting in waters that official records claim were cleared in 1945. Nazi Germany's submarine fleet was supposed to be accounted for, documented, destroyed. Case closed. Except the technology just proved otherwise. The ghost fleet emerges. In the summer of 2021, a team of marine archaeologists conducting a routine survey off the coast of Rügen Island detected anomalies on their sonar display. The shapes were unmistakable: submarine hulls. Not 1 or 2 scattered wrecks from known battles, but 7 boats lying in formation as if they had been deliberately positioned. The discovery team deployed remotely operated vehicles to investigate. At 53 meters depth, the cameras illuminated steel that had not seen daylight since the final weeks of World War II. Type 7C and Type 9 submarines, the workhorses of the Kriegsmarine's U-boat fleet. Their conning towers were still intact. Hull numbers were visible through decades of marine growth. And most disturbing of all, their external torpedo tubes showed no signs of combat damage. These boats had not been sunk in battle. They had been placed here deliberately. The team documented hull numbers and cross-referenced them against naval archives. 4 of the 7 submarines matched known vessels that were supposed to have been scuttled in the North Atlantic under Operation Regenbogen. Allied records indicated these boats had been sunk off Scotland and Norway in deep water, far from German shores. Yet here they were, clustered together in relatively shallow Baltic waters, less than 20 kilometers from the German coastline. The remaining 3 boats presented an even bigger problem. Their hull numbers did not appear in any surrender documentation. They were not listed among the captured boats. They were not recorded as combat losses. According to every official source, these 3 submarines had simply vanished in the chaos of Germany's collapse. The discovery made headlines in maritime archaeology circles, but the broader implications took longer to surface. As researchers began pulling archival records and cross-referencing patrol logs, a pattern emerged that no one had anticipated. These boats had been operating in the Baltic during the final month of the war. Their last known positions placed them near ports where evacuations were underway. Millions of German civilians and military personnel were fleeing westward ahead of the advancing Soviet forces. The Kriegsmarine was running Operation Hannibal, the largest emergency evacuation by sea in history. And some U-boats, instead of heading for surrender ports in the North Sea as ordered, had apparently turned back toward German waters. The question investigators faced was simple. What were 7 submarines doing in the Baltic when they were supposed to be scuttled in the Atlantic? And more importantly, what had they been carrying when they went down? The technology to answer those questions would require more than sonar and cameras. It would require AI-powered scanning systems capable of penetrating the hulls and mapping their interior spaces without disturbing what might be a protected war grave. By 2022, a joint German-Polish research team had secured funding for a comprehensive survey. They returned with equipment that had not existed even a decade earlier. Multi-beam sonar that could create 3-dimensional models, accurate to the centimeter, ground-penetrating radar, adapted for underwater use, and machine learning algorithms trained to distinguish between normal cargo and anomalous materials based on density signatures. What they found inside those hulls would force historians to reconsider what they thought they knew about the final days of Nazi Germany. Operation Regenbogen, the planned ending. To understand why these submarines being in the wrong place matters, you have to go back to the spring of 1945, when Germany's naval command faced an impossible situation. By April, the Reich was collapsing. Soviet forces were closing in from the east. American and British armies were advancing from the west. The Kriegsmarine surface fleet had been largely destroyed. What remained were approximately 350 U-boats scattered across ports from Norway to the Baltic. Admiral Karl Donitz, who had built and commanded the U-boat force since 1936, understood that surrender was inevitable. He was determined that Germany's submarine fleet would not fall intact into Allied hands. On May 2, 1945, Donitz issued the final order. All U-boats were to cease combat operations immediately. Boats at sea were to surface and proceed to designated Allied ports for surrender. Boats in German harbors were to be scuttled by their crews in deep water, far from shore, where salvage would be impossible. This was Operation Regenbogen, the systematic destruction of Germany's submarine force. The operation was supposed to be clean and documented. Each boat's captain received specific coordinates where his submarine was to be sunk. Crews were instructed to open the seacocks, flood the compartments, abandon ship, and report the precise location to Allied authorities. Between May 4th and May 8th, 123 U-boats complied. They sailed from their bases, reached the designated scuttling zones in the North Atlantic and Norwegian Sea, and sent themselves to the bottom. Allied observers monitored the operation. Positions were recorded. The submarines appeared on official lists as destroyed pursuant to the surrender agreement. Another 215 boats surrendered intact at Allied ports. The British took custody of most of them. American forces secured others. These boats were thoroughly searched, documented, and eventually sunk in Operation Deadlight or divided among the victorious powers for study. The official accounting suggested the matter was settled. 338 U-boats accounted for at the war's end. The remaining dozen or so were listed as lost to unknown causes in the final weeks of fighting. Case closed, except the numbers never quite added up. German naval records from early April 1945 showed 377 U-boats still on the roster. That left approximately 40 boats unaccounted for in the final tallies. Naval historians assumed most of these missing submarines had been sunk in the last desperate battles, their losses never properly recorded in the chaos of Germany's collapse. Some had certainly been destroyed at their moorings by Allied bombing. Others had been captured by Soviet forces advancing into Baltic ports, though Soviet records from that period were notoriously incomplete. The assumption was that wartime confusion had simply created gaps in the documentation. After all, accurate record-keeping is rarely a priority when your country is being overrun from 3 directions simultaneously. But what the Baltic discovery revealed was more troubling than missing paperwork. These boats were not random losses scattered across the ocean. They were deliberately positioned. They were in formation. Their location suggested they had been engaged in missions that someone decided should not be recorded. The official story said these boats were supposed to be in the North Atlantic. The evidence said they had gone somewhere else entirely. The record that does not match. The German naval archives housed at Freiburg contain detailed patrol logs for nearly every U-boat that operated during World War II. Departure dates, routes, crew rosters, cargo manifests, radio communications. The Kriegsmarine was meticulous about documentation, until it was not. When researchers attempted to trace the final movements of the 7 submarines found off Rügen Island, they discovered something disturbing. The patrol logs for these boats ended abruptly in mid-April 1945. No explanation, no final entries, just blank pages, where the last 3 weeks of their existence should have been. For the 4 boats that were supposed to have been scuttled in the North Atlantic, the records showed departure from Norwegian ports on May 5th. The coordinates of their reported sinking positions were listed, witnessed by Allied observers, confirmed. Except those boats were not in the North Atlantic. They were in the Baltic, which meant either the witnesses were wrong or someone had falsified the scuttling reports. The 3 boats with no surrender documentation presented a different problem. Their last recorded positions in early April placed them in the central Baltic, operating in areas where evacuation convoys were running. Then the records simply stopped. No orders to surrender, no orders to scuttle, no communication at all. Naval historians had encountered documentation gaps before, but this was different. These were not isolated instances of lost paperwork. This was systematic erasure. Someone had removed the final chapter of these submarine stories from the official record. The question was, who and why? One possibility was that these boats had been engaged in operations that high-ranking German officers did not want preserved for Allied intelligence to discover. Evacuation missions carrying high-value personnel or cargo, technology transfer operations. Missions that would have violated surrender terms if documented. Another possibility was darker, that these submarines had been sunk deliberately by their own side to conceal what they carried, and that the missing documentation was intentional. The evidence from the wrecks themselves would eventually point toward an answer, but that evidence required technology that could see inside the hulls without disturbing them. If you are still here, you have seen how 7 U-boats appeared in the wrong ocean with their records erased, and how the official story cannot explain their presence. Comment 2 below if you are following this investigation. And if you have not subscribed, please do so and turn on the bell notification so you do not miss what comes next. Your support helps us uncover the stories that post-war archives tried to bury. Now, let us talk about what the scanning technology revealed inside those hulls. What the technology revealed. The 2023 survey mission deployed equipment that would have seemed like science fiction to the men who commanded these boats 80 years earlier. The research vessel Aldebaran positioned itself over the wreck site, using dynamic positioning systems that held her steady despite currents and wind. Below, autonomous underwater vehicles descended into the Baltic gloom, their sensors sweeping the submarine hulls with overlapping scans. Multi-beam sonar mapped every rivet and weld seam. Ground-penetrating radar sent pulses through the steel, detecting density variations inside the pressure hulls. Synthetic aperture sonar created 3-dimensional images so detailed that researchers could identify individual objects within the compartments. The AI processing systems compiled everything into unified digital models. For the first time, investigators could examine what remained inside these boats without cutting through the hulls or disturbing what international maritime law protected as war graves. What the scans showed was not what anyone expected. The torpedo rooms were empty. No weapons. The boats had either fired their loadouts in combat, or more likely had deliberately jettisoned their torpedoes before settling on the seabed. This was consistent with boats being prepared for scuttling, not combat losses. The crew quarters showed evidence of hurried evacuation. Personal effects were scattered. Lockers stood open, but the distribution pattern was wrong. In a normal scuttling operation, crews would have gathered topside before abandoning ship. The scanning data suggested something different had happened here. Compartments showed flooding patterns consistent with the boat sinking while crews were still inside trying to escape. The battery compartments presented their own mystery. Type 7 U-boats carried 2 massive battery banks beneath the control room, each containing 60 cells weighing over half a ton. The scans showed that on several of the wrecks, these batteries had been deliberately destroyed. Acid had been released throughout the compartments, corroding everything it touched. This was not normal scuttling procedure. Battery destruction suggested someone had been trying to make these boats completely unsalvageable, even by their own side. But the most significant findings came from the aft compartments. Type 7C submarines had storage spaces in the stern sections, typically used for spare parts, provisions, and overflow cargo. The density scans showed these compartments were fully loaded on all 7 boats, but the signatures did not match standard submarine supplies. The materials showed density readings consistent with precious metals, gold, platinum, objects made from materials far denser than steel or provisions. And in 3 of the boats, the scans detected rectangular shapes approximately 30 centimeters long, packed in protective containers, stacked in rows. The dimensions matched exactly the size of standard Reichsbank gold bars. Similar density anomalies appeared in the forward torpedo rooms of 2 boats, in spaces where torpedoes should have been, but were not. Whatever had replaced the weapons was heavy, regularly shaped, and carefully secured. The research team faced an immediate problem. International law prohibited disturbing war graves. These were considered maritime burial sites. Salvage was forbidden without permission from multiple governments and families of the dead. But the scanning evidence suggested these boats had not been standard combat losses. They appeared to be cargo vessels, carrying materials someone had deemed important enough to evacuate during Germany's final collapse. The question was, what else had gone down with them that the density scans could not see? Documents, intelligence files, passenger lists. The kind of cargo that leaves no signature for sonar to detect, but would explain why someone had erased these boats from the official record. The answer to that question existed in other cases, boats that had been discovered earlier, inspected before modern salvage prohibitions took effect, and found to be carrying more than just precious metals. The cargo question. The discovery of cargo submarines is not unprecedented. What makes the Baltic boats significant is the pattern they reveal. In 1972, Swedish salvage teams located U-347 off the southern Swedish coast. The boat had been sunk by depth charges in September 1944. When divers reached the wreck, they found the forward torpedo room loaded with mercury in steel flasks, over 60 tons of it. Mercury was critical for weapons production, and Germany had been shipping it from occupied territories back to the homeland throughout the war. That find established that U-boats were being used for high-value cargo transport, not just combat patrols. In 1995, divers found U-864 off the Norwegian coast. The boat had been torpedoed by a British submarine in February 1945 while carrying jet engine components, missile guidance systems, and 65 tons of mercury in steel containers. The Norwegian government spent over $100 million studying how to contain the mercury contamination spreading from the wreck. These boats had been documented. Their cargo missions were recorded in surviving German naval files. They were part of known operations to move strategic materials. The Baltic boats were different. Their missions were not documented. Their cargo was not recorded. Their final position suggested they had been heading away from the evacuation routes, not toward them. The scanning evidence showed precious metals. Gold and platinum were not the only high-value materials Germany was desperate to save in April 1945. The Reich had spent 6 years developing weapons technology that the Allies had not yet seen. This included jet engines, guided missiles, advanced submarine designs, and nuclear research materials. When defeat became inevitable, German scientists and military officials faced a choice: let those secrets fall into Allied hands, or destroy them. Some chose destruction. Laboratories were burned, prototypes smashed, documents shredded. Others chose evacuation. If Germany was finished, perhaps the technology could be preserved elsewhere, sold, traded, or used to bargain for better treatment in the post-war world. U-234, captured by American forces in May 1945, was found carrying 560 kilograms of uranium oxide bound for Japan. The boat also held jet fighter blueprints, radar components, and infrared proximity fuses. This was not cargo for sale. This was a strategic technology transfer. The question that haunts researchers examining the Baltic wrecks is simple. What were these 7 boats carrying that was valuable enough to divert them from surrender orders and important enough to erase from the official record? Density scans showed precious metals, but metals alone do not require documentation purges. You can admit you were moving gold without triggering international incidents. What you cannot admit is what else might have been aboard. Passenger lists for high-ranking officials fleeing prosecution. Intelligence files documenting wartime operations that implicated people who would later hold positions in post-war governments. Research data from programs that would later be labeled war crimes. Technology that was supposed to have been destroyed under surrender terms. The evacuation convoys that ran through the Baltic in April and May 1945 carried millions of refugees. They also carried scientists, engineers, intelligence officers, personnel, anyone who had reason to fear Soviet capture. Some of those evacuations were documented. Others were not. If high-value individuals or materials were being moved on U-boats during the final weeks, if those missions were deliberately kept off the books, then the boats themselves became liabilities once they completed their runs. You could not leave them intact to be captured and searched by Allied or Soviet forces. The solution would be to scuttle them thoroughly, in locations where recovery would be difficult and where their presence would not raise immediate questions. The Baltic wrecks show exactly that pattern. Boats positioned in relatively deep water, batteries destroyed, cargo still aboard, documentation erased. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to make sure these submarines and whatever they carried would stay hidden. For 80 years, the plan worked. Why no one was watching? The official post-war accounting of the U-boat fleet was always incomplete. Allied intelligence officers knew the numbers did not add up, but by the summer of 1945, there were more pressing concerns than tracking down every missing submarine. Germany was being divided into occupation zones. Millions of displaced persons needed resettlement. War crimes trials were beginning. The atomic bomb had been dropped on Japan, and within months, the alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union was fracturing into what would become the Cold War. In that context, a few dozen unaccounted submarines did not seem like a priority worth pursuing. If some boats had been sunk in locations their crews never reported, if records had been destroyed or lost, it was unfortunate but not urgent. The British Admiralty compiled its final U-boat assessment in 1946. The report listed 338 boats accounted for at the war's end. 156 had surrendered intact to Allied forces. 123 had been scuttled pursuant to Admiral Donitz's orders. The remainder were listed as combat losses or destroyed at their moorings. Approximately 40 boats remained unaccounted for. The report noted these gaps but offered no recommendations for further investigation. The assumption was that wartime chaos had simply created holes in the documentation. Records had been burned. Radio communications had been interrupted. Boats had gone down in the final desperate weeks without anyone surviving to report their loss. It was plausible. It was tidy. And it allowed everyone to move forward without asking uncomfortable questions. What the official accounting did not mention was that some gaps in the record were not accidental. Allied intelligence had captured intact German naval archives when they occupied Berlin and other administrative centers. Those archives contained patrol logs, cargo manifests, personnel rosters, and communications records for nearly every U-boat operation conducted during the war. But when researchers began examining those captured files in subsequent decades, they discovered something disturbing. Entire sections had been removed before the archives were handed over to historical institutions. Patrol logs that should have documented the final weeks of the war were missing. Cargo manifests for April and May 1945 had been pulled from multiple boat files. Personnel records for crews operating in the Baltic during the evacuation period had vanished. This was not random loss. This was systematic redaction. Someone with access to the archives had gone through and removed specific documentation related to the war's final month. The question was who and on whose authority. One possibility was that German naval officers, in the brief window between surrender and Allied occupation, had destroyed records that would have implicated them or their subordinates in operations that might be considered war crimes. Evacuation missions that prioritized SS personnel over refugees. Cargo runs moving looted materials. Technology transfers that violated emerging surrender terms. Another possibility was that Allied intelligence had classified and removed certain records because they revealed operations that would become inconvenient in the post-war political environment. If high-ranking officials who would later serve in the West German government had been involved in questionable activities during the war's final weeks, those records might have been deemed too sensitive for public access. The Cold War context made this more likely. By 1949, West Germany was being rebuilt as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. The same military and intelligence officers who had fought for Hitler were now considered valuable assets in the struggle against communism. Thoroughly investigating what those officers had done in April 1945, where they had gone, what they had evacuated, would have been politically problematic. Better to let the gaps remain gaps. Better to assume that missing boats were simply lost at sea with no survivors. Better not to ask what 7 submarines were doing in the Baltic when they were supposed to be scuttling in the North Atlantic. The institutional incentive to investigate was minimal. The British had larger concerns in their occupation zone. The Americans were focused on rebuilding German industry and rearming the new West German state. The French wanted reparations, not historical accounting. And the Soviets, who controlled the Baltic coastline where these boats went down, had their own reasons for not publicizing what they might have known. Soviet naval forces had swept the Baltic thoroughly in 1945 and 1946, clearing mines, documenting wrecks, and salvaging anything of value. If they had discovered 7 U-boats in formation off Rügen Island, they almost certainly would have investigated. But no Soviet reports mention such a discovery. Either they missed the boats entirely, which seems unlikely given the intensity of their survey efforts, or they found them and chose not to document what they contained. The Soviet Union had its own post-war narrative to maintain. They were liberators, not conquerors. If those U-boats contained evidence of high-ranking German officials or looted materials being evacuated through Baltic ports, evidence that would have complicated the story of Soviet heroism and German villainy, it might have been simpler to leave the boats where they lay and report nothing. So the decades passed. The Cold War hardened. Germany was divided, rebuilt, eventually reunified. The generation that had lived through the war died off, and the missing U-boats remained missing, their absence noted in footnotes of naval histories but never seriously investigated. The assumption among maritime historians was that these boats had been located decades earlier by fishing vessels or survey ships, but never reported because no one saw commercial value in documenting another U-boat wreck. The Baltic was littered with wartime losses. A few more submarines on the seabed were hardly remarkable. What changed was technology. The survey equipment that found the Rügen boats in 2021 was being used for coastal mapping, not historical research. The operators were not looking for submarines. They simply appeared on the displays because modern sonar can see what earlier systems missed. And once they were found, once the hull numbers were documented and cross-referenced against archives, the gaps in the official story became impossible to ignore. These were not random losses scattered across the ocean. These were boats in formation, deliberately positioned, with their records systematically erased. The evidence demanded investigation. But investigation required political will. And political will required someone in authority to decide that answering 80-year-old questions was worth the complications those answers might create. International maritime law protects the boats as war graves. Salvage is prohibited without permission from multiple governments. Germany would have to authorize intrusion into what are technically German military remains. Poland controls the waters where the boats rest. Russia, as successor state to the Soviet Union, might claim interest based on its occupation of the region when the boats went down. Getting all parties to agree to a thorough investigation, including potential recovery of cargo and documentation, would require diplomatic coordination that no one has shown any interest in pursuing. Because opening these boats means confronting whatever missions they were running. And confronting those missions means asking questions about who sent them, who they carried, and who decided their records should be erased. The technology exists to answer those questions. AI-powered scanning has already revealed precious metals in the cargo holds. More invasive investigation could identify documents, passenger remains, and materials that would clarify what these boats were doing in the Baltics in May 1945. But the political will does not exist. The German government has shown no interest in disturbing war graves for historical curiosity. Poland has larger priorities. Russia is unlikely to cooperate on any joint investigation given current political tensions. And international maritime authorities have no mandate to force the issue. So the boats remain where they are, protected by law, sealed by politics, and gradually deteriorating as salt water corrodes what 8 decades have already weakened. The scanning data exists in research archives. The anomalies have been documented. But the final answers, the ones that would explain why these boats went to the bottom where they did with their records erased, are locked inside hulls that may never be opened. Not because we lack the technology, not because we cannot reach them, but because some institutions have decided that certain questions are better left unasked. Some secrets from 1945 are still too sensitive to examine, and the official story, incomplete as it is preferable to the complications that the complete truth might reveal. The 7 submarines off Rügen Island are evidence. But evidence only matters if someone with authority decides it should be examined. And 80 years later, that decision remains unmade.